Hey guys, welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, the channel where curiosity meets chronic drowsiness. Tonight we wander somewhere older than time and softer than dreams, to the smoky, jazzy heart of the 1920s, where danger wore a fedora and even the roughest criminals had a favorite pair of slippers. Ah, the Roaring Twenties, that butter-smooth slice of time between one world war and another, when flappers danced like they were trying to whack the past off their ankles, and jazz floated through every window like perfumed cigarette smoke. While the history books paint the era in splashes of bootlegging, Tommy guns, and police raids, tonight we slip past the headlines to lounge in the quiet corners of gangster life. Because even mobsters, yes, even the ones who could order a kneecapping before breakfast, had downtime. And wouldn't you know it, they enjoyed it in the most delightfully mundane ways. Oh, and before your eyelids press themselves shut, be sure to press that like button. Rumor has it, every like lets one gangster from 1925 finally take a nap. Now, settle in, socks on, eyes closed. Let's begin. First, picture the city. Chicago, 1924. The skyline hasn't quite earned its steel teeth yet, and most buildings are still red-bricked and square-jawed. The streets hum with trolley bells and ocarina-playing buskers, and underground, things positively simmer. Thanks to the Volstead Act, Prohibition, as is better known, alcohol is illegal, which means bootleggers, speakeasies, and, of course, gangsters. Lots and lots of sharply dressed men with questionable morals and excellent cologne. But here's the secret they don't teach you in gangster school. For every high-octane smuggling run or dramatic turf war, there were long stretches of, well, gloriously boring afternoons. There are only so many warehouses you can acquire, and only so many rival gangs to glare at across the cafe. So what did they do with their time? They pampered themselves mostly. Take Charles Lucky Luciano, as smooth with a comb as he was with a crowbar. Lucky was known not for his brutality, well, okay, also for his brutality, but for his fine taste in suits, Italian shoes and skincare. Gangsters of the 20s were often obsessed with their appearances. Think sleek hairdos, hand-tailored vests, and more silk than a Parisian lingerie shop. If you walked into a mob hideout at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday, you were just as likely to find a gangster getting a manicure as cleaning a pistol. But fashion was only the beginning. Card games were the true religion of downtime. In smoky back rooms, behind beeped buzzers and triple-knocked doors, men who controlled entire neighborhoods would hunch over small tables and argue about something as ethereal as whether a 3 of clubs beat poor strategy. Gin rummy, poker, and occasionally a misguided attempt at chess were staples. Some even played with fake names, as if they needed more secrets. And the bets? Oh, they were never small. A single hand might cost 2 sets of hubcaps and a week of loyalty. In some cities, entire corner bakeries swapped hands over a bad bluff. Then, there were the evening escapes. To the speakeasies, of course. But not always for crime. Sometimes just for music. Picture a cellar room, lit with candles in wine bottles, where the gin is so bootlegged it might be part gasoline. On stage, a jazz trio plays a slow, sultry number, the kind that makes your heartbeat match the pulse of the bass. Behind a corner table, a mob boss sips from a chipped glass with pinky raised and eyes closed. Not plotting, not threatening, just listening. Even gangsters needed music to forget the soundtracks in their heads. And while it's tempting to imagine they spent every spare minute checking their shoulder holsters, truth be told, many wasted hours in the gentlest ways, browsing haberdasheries, arguing about cigars, or reading the paper upside down just to keep secrets from each other. Al Capone himself was an avid fan of banjo music and had a surprisingly extensive record collection later in life. If that doesn't humanize a man, nothing will. So yes, the gangster life was brutal, dangerous, and riddled with betrayals. But it also had Sunday mornings spent in silk bathrobes, eating cold eggs, and listening to jazz on a Victrola. And as the sun vanished behind a skyline that didn't yet know it would be history, these tough men of molten morals could be found reclining in armchairs, deep in existential debates about whether suspenders or belts were more respectable. It is in this softer shadow of infamy where we'll linger tonight, because sometimes even the hardest hearts crave a little peace. Now, lie back, straighten your imaginary tie, and let's meander toward the next velvet-curtained corner of this strange, sleepy world. History, at its most relaxed, has a way of surprising us. When we think gangster, our minds often flood with fedoras, frowns, and firearms. But tucked between bootleg deals and bribing city officials, these Roaring Twenties outlaws had a surprising fondness for something far softer. Leisurewear. Yes, leisurewear. Now, to put ourselves in the right headspace, and preferably the right loungewear, let's slip mentally into a smoky upstairs apartment in Chicago, 1923. The jazz floats like warm candle wax out of an old Victrola. Someone's whistling, "Yes, we have no bananas." And in the corner, slouched in a surprisingly floral armchair, we find a man named Joey Soft Ankles Mancini, wearing silk pajamas with tiny embroidered squirrels. Gangsters were not all go, go, go. In fact, many of them relished the simple, lounging moments between jobs, like a cat dozing in the sun between rampages. Tailors from New York to Kansas City understood this, which is why, for the more well-to-do criminal, having a wardrobe of lounging robes and velvet slippers was as essential as, say, a Tommy gun or a brother-in-law who didn't ask questions. And don't laugh at the squirrel embroidery. Well, maybe laugh softly. These small flourishes were part of a gangster's personal brand. Much like today's influencers, they were curating a vibe. Dangerous but approachable. Unlawful but unbelievably well moisturized. But fashion isn't all they fussed over. Recreational pursuits abounded, especially after sundown. One of the more curious ones? Indoor bowling. Yes, while our modern image of gangsters might involve swanky clubs and back alley deals, a surprising number of speakeasies had their own makeshift bowling alleys tucked away behind bookcases or under floors, like a mobster's version of Narnia. It wasn't uncommon for a man like Frankie Nosebeans Pavone to polish off a risky whiskey shipment and immediately retire to the lounge to knock down 10 pins with the kind of passionate grunt usually reserved for car chases and stolen cannolis. The game brought a kind of predictable satisfaction. A set of pins knocked over by a ball, no police involved. Glorious. Evenings often followed a subtle pattern. After the initial business, the crew, wearing their finest leisurewear, naturally, would disperse into their favoured relaxation stations. Some occupied themselves with a little light cheating at cards, nothing too flashy, just minor acts of dishonesty to keep the edge sharp. Others played the piano with abandon. Though most could barely manage, Mary Had a Little Lamb, without stabbing 3 neighbouring notes in the process. And speaking of music, one of the most beloved ways for 1920s gangsters to take the edge off. Singing. Lloyd Teacup Russo, feared for his quick temper and monogrammed brass knuckles, reportedly cried every time he attempted to sing My Blue Heaven, not because the song moved him, but because he insisted on singing it in a key known only to bats and clarinets. But perhaps the softest hobby of all goes to Richard Silky Hands Del Vecchio. You'll appreciate this one. Every Thursday night, Richard gathered his closest associates in his sunroom. Bootleggers love a proper sunroom, for what he titled Gentleman's Gardening Hour. There, these hardened gangsters cooed over their bonsai trees, clipped dead leaves with surgical precision, and argued quietly about cucumber spacing. It's entirely possible that no one ever got whacked in a room that smelled of mint and tomato vines. These private moments of peace were never entirely free of tension, of course. The promise of surveillance, betrayal, or a minor explosion always loomed around the corner. But just for a second, a sip of bathtub gin, a chess match beside a humming radiator, a stolen nap during an operetta record, you'd catch a glimpse of something rare. Stillness. Even in the blood-spattered rush of Prohibition America, sleep wore a tailored robe and smoked eucalyptus cigars. And who among us wouldn't fall asleep a little easier knowing that somewhere once upon a time, Big Tony Two Coats Vaccaro sat curled on a fainting couch, knitting what may or may not have been a lopsided scarf for his mother. And as the moonlight settled softly across that city of secrets, casting little crescent shadows on lawn flamingos and tomato plants alike, the world of crime took one last yawn. Tomorrow would bring more danger, more deals, more dry cleaning. But for now, let's slip through one more secret door, where jazz purrs from phonographs and the sweet smell of carnations hides in the wallpaper. There, just ahead, we'll find an unexpected indulgence, surprisingly bubbly. I'll tell you all about it in a moment. Somewhere between the roaring laughter of a speakeasy and the low grumble of a Studebaker rolling down a moonlit alley lies a quieter moment in gangster life. Unhurried evenings around a card table, where time dripped slower than molasses in January, and nobody clutched their Tommy gun, at least not visibly. You see, gangsters worked hard, bootlegging, bribing, brokering shady deals. It takes it out of a fella. And when the sun dipped low behind the Art Deco skyline, even the toughest mugs in Chicago or New York needed a break. Free time, while technically a legal term they weren't fond of, was embraced in long, lazy stretches of luxury, leisure, and just a hint of paranoia. Let's set the scene. A smoky back room, tucked behind what appears to be a perfectly respectable tailor shop. It is, in fact, a front, a word that gangsters wielded like opera critics use nuanced. Behind racks of suspiciously untouched suits and ties lies the entrance to a domain of downtime. Candlelight flickers. A Victrola croons a sleepy jazz tune just out of key. A bottle of Canadian whiskey, freshly unlabeled, slouches in the corner like it too had a long day. And there they are, gangsters, not lurking in alleys or hurling whiskey barrels into rivers, but leaning casually around a green felt table, playing poker with half interest and full egos. The chips clack in soothing rhythms. Cigar smoke curls lazily toward the pressed tin ceiling. It's the 1920s version of me time. Card games in these inner sanctums weren't just pastimes. They were performances. Stories were told. Reputations fluffed. And lies dealt out like appetizers. Some would boast about dealings with judges, others about the shipment that allegedly fell off a train. Frankly, most of the stories were more fiction than F. Scott Fitzgerald after a gin spritzer. And speaking of gin, oh, the drinks. Gangsters much preferred their own product, naturally. Whether it had been smuggled over the Detroit River or passed hand to hand through a dozen Chicago basements, It ended up in cut crystal glasses, served with a twist of smug satisfaction. No better gin than the gin they can't tax, they'd murmur. Not that they paid taxes anyway. Of course, relaxation had its rules. For every lolling laugh and gently clinking glass, an undercurrent of caution hummed below. Even at leisure, many of these men sat with their backs to walls and threw occasional glances toward the door. It wasn't just habit, it was survival. One did not climb the underworld social ladder by being careless. You ordered your whiskey neat, your jokes sharp, and your exits planned, just in case someone stopped playing fair. Still, there were moments of surprising tenderness. Despite their crooked reputations and starch-collared bravado, these men had hobbies that bordered on adorable. Dominic Spoons Mancini, an enforcer with a jaw like granite, once spent hours before a heist knitting mittens. Said it calmed his nerves. And believe it or not, Meyer Lansky enjoyed math puzzles. Not just money laundering, but actual puzzles, the kind with numbers and quiet satisfaction. He called them his mental warm-ups. He probably would have made a terrific Sudoku influencer had Instagram existed in 27. Leisure, in the end, was a currency unto itself. Downtime meant a chance to talk, to plan, to build ladders of influence one snifter and sly grin at a time. And so the evening stretched on, card by card, toast by toast. There was something almost poetic about the quiet clinking of a whiskey glass beside a pistol. Outside, the world swirled in jazz and discontent. But here, in these hidden corners, Gangsters proved that even the lawless needed loafers and low lighting. Beneath the bravado, there beat the same tired hearts as yours and mine, just with a few extra bullet wounds. As the evening deepened, stories became slower, and cigars burned down to sleepy stubs. A king of hearts slid slowly across the green velvet. Someone chuckled, someone else blinked, heavy-lidded. Outside, a police siren whined in the cold distance. But inside, it was just leisure now. And soon, as we gently fade from the glow of the card table, the next chapter quietly beckons. From a different room, with different pastimes, and perhaps something sweeter awaiting on the menu. Let us drift now, quietly, into the velvet-lined shadows of 1920s leisure. Not the kind with bullets and bootleg chases. No, not tonight. Tonight we wander into what happened after the heist, before the arrests, and during. The moments when even the most feared gangsters leaned back in silk pajamas, exhaled a ring of cigar smoke, and wondered if they'd left the stove on. Because yes, even Al Capone had downtime. And in that precious in-between world, the late afternoon hush before the jazz band warmed up, before the feds studied their notebooks, and before anyone had to threaten anyone else with a violin case full of 45s, Gangsters did something altogether surprising. They relaxed. Now, you might imagine that Prohibition-era gangsters spent every spare moment counting illegal whiskey barrels or staring intensely out smoky windows. And while there was indeed a lot of staring, you'd be surprised at just how dapper and domestic their downtime could be. Let's start with wardrobe, because how you dress says a lot about your priorities. And for the typical gangster unwinding at home or in a private speakeasy, silk pajamas were not out of the question. In fact, they were alarmingly in the question. Picture a man with a scarred face, a revolver within reach, and a monogrammed satin robe he had flown in from Paris. You see, these were not minimalist men. Scarface himself, Alphonse Capone, once lived in a suite at the Lexington Hotel in Chicago, wallpapered with gold leaf accents and lined with rugs soft enough to silence 1,000 regrets. He enjoyed long, elaborate meals supplied by top chefs and a secret escape tunnel, just in case dessert got too intense. But even Capone couldn't resist the charm of a good smoke and a game of cards with the boys. Cigars, by the way, were practically mandatory. Cuban, if possible, though many opted for Italian imports out of a sense of romantic nationalism. Picture it. After hours at a speakeasy, the hard edges of the day softened by bourbon whispers and cello jazz, waistcoats unbuttoned, spats kicked off, someone arguing, gently, about who actually won the last hand of poker, even though Lefty Luciano clearly cheated. And then, of course, the music. Gangsters loved music the way squirrels love overly complex nut puzzles, which is to say, with obsession and occasional property damage. Jazz wasn't just background noise, it was part of their identity. Many gangsters were loyal patrons of black musicians who couldn't get bookings in uptown clubs, but found a warm, if legally questionable, welcome in subterranean speakeasies. There, beneath the creaky floorboards of the sober world, a trumpet might cry softly into the night as a gangster closed his eyes, a fedora over his chest, dreaming sweetly of tax fraud. Speaking of taxes, and we will, though not too loudly, even in their leisure time, gangsters had a strange respect for organization. Sure, they burned down entire establishments, but heaven forbid someone moved their golf clubs. Ah yes, you might not expect it, but golf was quite the popular pastime. Not only did it help cultivate an image of gentlemanly respectability, but it was also exceedingly hard to bug a sand trap. Meyer Lansky was said to enjoy a round or two when not calculating the precise profit margin of illegal slot machines. But for others, it was the theatre. Fat Tony Salerno was rumoured to enjoy amateur opera, not performing, mind you, but attending. He had a particular fondness for tenors with dramatic neck veins. It gave the man goosebumps in a way a Tommy gun simply could not. And Bugsy Siegel, a secret gourmet, present him with a dry roast chicken, and you'd see a more terrifying expression than anything he wore in a shootout. So we have gangsters in robes, listening to opera, smoking cigars, debating the perfect souffle rise. It's not that the violence wasn't there. It always waited outside, in the alley, like a nervous chauffeur. But in these small oases of stolen calm, men who had built criminal empires found themselves, if only briefly, as domestic as your Aunt Mildred, winding the Victrola at twilight. Which brings us softly now to the question, what happens when the music moves from jazz to swing? The speakeasies fade into the daylight, and gangsters in pajamas become celebrities in pinstripes. We'll drift there soon enough. In the hushed glow of an apartment lamp, fringed with beaded tassels, and the scent of expensive cologne mixed with last night's cigars, we find a gangster at rest. Not in a smoky alley or a shadowy speakeasy shootout, as the movies like to imagine, but instead, curled up on a velvet fainting couch, arguing over gin rummy rules with a man named Louis who always cheats when you're not looking. Welcome to a lesser-known pleasure of Prohibition-era gangsterdom. Downtime. Even men who ran bootleg empires, evaded federal agents, and carried concealed weapons inside monogram briefcases needed a break sometimes. And when they did, dear listener, they did it in style. Sort of. Imagine this. It's 1926. A warm night blankets Chicago in its velvet hush. Al Capone, not yet the most wanted man in America, merely a rising entrepreneur, has just hosted a dinner party. On the menu, rack of lamb, bootlegged French wine, and an indescribably jiggly gelatin dessert that no one dared question, lest it end in cement shoes. But after the last champagne glass clinks and the hired jazz trio packs up their trumpet cases, the gangsters retreat to leisure. Much of it took place in private back rooms, neither saloons nor dens of villainy, but peculiarly well-furnished sanctuaries full of silk, card tables, and an abundance of throw pillows. Frankly, more throw pillows than one might expect from men who'd recently bribed a mayor. They gathered in these secret spaces to engage in non-lethal pastimes. Board games like Monopoly hadn't entered their lives yet, or perhaps it was too close to home, but poker, baccarat, and even dominoes were popular with the capos and consigliere set. Some took great pride in elaborate games of pinochle, which, if you've never played, is like the chess of card games, only more confusing and potentially more dangerous if you're caught counting cards. When their hands weren't full of cards, many found joy in more delicate hobbies. Believe it or not, some gangsters painted. Yes, painted. Watercolors even. Machine Gun Kelly was rumored, not confirmed, but delightfully rumored, to enjoy still life painting. His favorite subject, fruit bowls, ideally ones placed next to freshly oiled Tommy guns. For those inclined toward the oral arts, radio broadcasts became a cherished retreat. Families crowded around Philco sets, but so too did crime syndicates. One might picture them sipping brandy, chuckling softly at Amos and Andy, a program problematic by modern standards, but back then a massive hit. Listening together allowed even hardened rum runners to feel a flicker of normalcy, their bootleg empires muted beneath the crackle of a distant saxophone. Clothing was another crucial component of the gangster leisure aesthetic. At home, far from the tailored pinstripes and spats, they embraced an unexpected softness. Silk dressing gowns, slippers with modest embroidery. Some wore ascots. Ascots, while the public feared them, at home they resembled wealthy grandfathers who might offer you a Werther's original and a knowing wink. Baths were long and sacred, often drawn by a trusted valet or, in some cases, by the gangster himself. Steaming hot, cucumber slices optional. And lest you think these bathtubs brimmed with tough thoughts and violent plots, I assure you, they usually brimmed with bubbles. Fragrant, store-bought, very dignified bubbles. Their underworld crimes did not extend to skipping self-care. Books, too, provided a quieter thrill. Many gangsters read detective novels with a sense of irony. Dashiell Hammett's stories were passed around discreetly, sometimes laughed at, sometimes fiercely debated. This gumshoe's a moron, one might mutter. You never tail a guy through Chinatown on a Thursday, too crowded. And so we see, tucked beneath the myths and mayhem, a softer, silk-robed underbelly of mobster life. A life of slow gin and slower jazz, of vaguely cheating at cards and carefully aligning domino tiles. The Roaring Twenties, they roared, yes, but not always with gunfire. Sometimes it was just a snore from the chaise lounge, while Benny Goodman played softly on the gramophone. And as night deepened over speakeasy alleys and quiet sitting rooms, a new kind of game began. One involving city maps, whispered names, and favors to be cashed. But that, dear listener, is a nighttime tale of another sort. If you walked through a foggy Chicago street around 11:42 p.m. in the year 1926, and you happened to pass a completely legal-looking storefront pulsing softly with faint saxophones from behind a heavy velvet curtain, you may have caught a glimpse of history rocking itself gently to sleep in 4/4 time. Welcome, dear dreamer, to the clandestine cradle of the gangster night off, the jazz club. Now, don't let Hollywood's trench coats and Tommy guns convince you otherwise. Not every mobster was glowering in an alley. Sometimes they were clumsily tapping their foot under a banquet table while eating a cold chicken sandwich that had succumbed to the rhythm hours before their appetite caught up. You see, when you run an empire of bootleg spirits and citywide favors, your downtime is precious, peculiar, and often set to live music. Gangsters of the 1920s had a surprisingly tender spot for jazz, not just the upbeat chaos of brass and bass, but also what it represented. Jazz was unlicensed, unapologetically free, and suspiciously enthusiastic about the trumpet. The perfect soundtrack for a man who ran from responsibility by day and from the police by night. These underground clubs, often referred to as speakeasies, got their whimsical name from what you had to do to get in. Speak easy, lest your voice betray the vibrating thrill of illegal liquor in your system. Inside, however, you'd be met with velvet drapes, cigarette smoke modern arting its way toward the ceiling, and maybe, just maybe, a mob boss swaying tragically out of sync with Duke Ellington's band. Many a tough man, wearing shoes imported from somewhere with cobblestones and silent judgment, found himself surprised by how gently the melancholy slid off a saxophone. Al Capone himself, when not orchestrating terribly inconvenient murders, was said to have a fondness for the sentimental tunes of Louis Armstrong. He even reportedly hired musicians to play at his parties, not as a show of power, but because the trumpet made his soup taste fancier. This is, of course, an unverified claim. But isn't it lovely to imagine? Imagine Big Joe Lipstick Malone, named not because he wore any, but because he once robbed a train using only a compact mirror and a gaze so striking it made a conductor forget federal guidelines. There he is, sitting on a plush banquette in the back of some tucked-away jazz cellar, head bobbing slightly, eyes closed, drifting peacefully among the piano's rippling notes, while a waiter replaces his spent cocktail with a tall glass of something that definitely isn't lemonade. Mob nightlife dance between elegance and silliness. Picture a group of otherwise severe-looking men who kept ledgers of unpaid debts under their hats and tiny revolvers in their shoelaces, arguing gently over whether the clarinetist's licks were too staccato or just avant-garde, or whether the corned beef sandwich was slightly too dry for a Thursday. These were the real debates of the night: musicality and mayonnaise. What you might not expect is how involved some wise guys became in the musical scene, for reasons warming the heart and the wallet. Owning a club wasn't just classy, it was smart. Gangsters could launder money through ticket sales, rub elbows with lawmakers too nervous to leave, and even request their favorite song 3 times in a row without anyone daring to disagree. A few gangsters even offered patronage to particular musicians, arranging recording sessions and better instruments. But of course, all support came with the unspoken caveat: play that song I like, or your next gig will be in a more vertical location. Still, despite the knots of risk and the urge to monologue in noir-style lighting, many of these men genuinely loved the music. And for a few sweet hours, they weren't tyrants or trespassers. They were just people enjoying the sanctuary of syncopation, reflecting on life's big questions. How do you smuggle 20 cases of gin through a toll booth? And what's the ideal pickle-to-meat ratio? As the clock ticked past midnight and the trumpets tired, the scene would begin to fade. Crowds thinned, heels clicked faintly in alleyways, and a lonely sax sighed a final note under a bare bulb. Our well-dressed gangsters, half asleep and full of pastrami, would tip the band, tip the hat, and disappear gently into the cloud of early mist. ready for another day of crimes that would surely look worse in daylight. Now, as eyelids grow heavier, like a jazz ballad settling into its bittersweet final bars, we'll leave these nocturnal nobility behind. But where did the gangsters go once the music died and someone suggested something alarmingly clever about poker? We'll wander that smoky trail next. Let it pull us forward, in slow, sleepy step. Moonlight on polished shoes and saxophones curling sound into smoky corners. Tonight, we tiptoe through the zinnias and gardenias, real ones sometimes, into the often surprisingly fragrant world of gangster leisure. Yes, in between shootouts and bootlegging spreadsheets, gangsters of the Roaring Twenties had hobbies, and believe it or not, some of those passions blossomed right at home, in their gardens. Now, let's be honest. When you think of mobsters, you're more likely to picture bulletproof Cadillacs, not bougainvilleas. But behind the tailored pinstripes and wary glances were men, very careful men, with unexpectedly gentle pastimes. One such surprising pursuit, gardening. You see, Prohibition-era gangsters, for all their bravado, spent much of their time waiting for shipments, waiting for police bribes to go through, waiting for rival gangs to make the next move. And while some filled those hours with dice games or expensive cigars, others, like Big Jim Colosimo, found comfort coaxing roses into bloom. Big Jim, who ran one of Chicago's most opulent brothels and was known lovingly as Diamond Jim, for his affection for sparkly lapel accessories, maintained a lavish garden estate that was, according to one bootlegger, like Versailles, if Versailles smelled more like cigar smoke and pasta. His greenhouse reportedly housed orchids from the Philippines and a fig tree that allegedly only bore fruit for men wearing white fedoras. Was that superstition? Of course. But that's gangsters for you. Murderously practical and endlessly ritualistic. Gardening also offered a clever PR angle. While newspapers ran headlines about speakeasy raids and gunfire on the L train, these men were gently pruning hydrangeas as if to say, me, a criminal, I just fertilized the begonias. And perhaps there's a logic there. It's harder to shoot someone when your hands are already full of tulip bulbs. Some mobsters went even further. Oni the Killer Madden, a British-born mob boss with a taste for fancy things, was known to host tea parties in his manicured backyard, complete with croquet. That's right, croquet. It was all terribly civilized, until someone hit a rosebush too hard and a polite conversation about turf turned into what's diplomatically called a spirited negotiation. Others leaned into animal husbandry. No, really. Al Capone, that infamous face of organized crime, kept a well-staffed compound where he raised racehorses with names like Bullet Biscuit and Madame Moonshine. Whether or not those horses actually raced remains uncertain. It's equally possible Capone enjoyed naming them dramatically and petting their noses after a hard day selling bathtub gin. There's even evidence that some mobsters took to beekeeping. Men who ordered hits in the morning were tending to colonies of bees in the late afternoon. 1 jar of honey per cousin, if you will. It makes more sense than you'd think. Bees are organized, hierarchical, and fiercely protective of their territory. Truly, the gangsters of the garden world. Now, lest you think it was all lavender sachets and mint sprigs, we must remember that these weren't your average allotment enthusiasts. Many garden parties doubled as strategy sessions, with lemon bars served beside blueprints of cities and cheese platters placed at strategic points on regional maps. If you found yourself invited to such a party, you smiled, ate the bruschetta, and absolutely did not ask who was bringing the fertilizer. But amidst all the schemes and shady plans, there was something earnestly sincere about these quiet hobbies. Mobsters understood the balance of chaos and control. They trafficked in disorder, but in lilacs and lilies there was a momentary peace, an order that didn't require bribes or bullets, just sunlight, water, and a little blind hope. And maybe that's what made it all feel so dreamlike, a paradox of petals and power. Gangsters walking through rows of dahlias, whispering to each other about bootlegging routes and bourbon shipments, all while admiring the way the wind rustled through their prized rose hips. Perhaps beneath the gangster's fedora, nestled somewhere between muscle and myth, there was a quiet longing for normalcy and fewer bugs. So the next time you smell gardenias on the breeze, remember, once upon a time, a mob boss may have grown those very blossoms, perhaps with slightly muddy Oxfords and a pistol awkwardly tucked in his apron. Now close your eyes, gentle dreamer, and step carefully past the potted orchids, because up next, we're slipping into something even more alluring than a secret garden. Something with sequins, saxophones, and a bit of bootlegged bravado. If you happen to peek through the velvet curtains of a speakeasy in the summer of 1926, you might expect to see chaos. Jazz bands spinning wild notes, dames with flapper dresses swinging low, and mobsters brooding in smoky corners. And, yes, that certainly happened. But just as often, you'd find something far more subdued. A small group of grown men arguing over a game of shuffleboard with the passion of Roman senators debating the fall of the Republic. Yes, dear dreamer, gangsters played shuffleboard. It wasn't just the territory of beachside retirees and cruise ship enthusiasts. In the Roaring Twenties, shuffleboard and billiards were wildly popular in the backrooms of private clubs, most of which were either operated by, frequented by, or quietly extorted by organized crime figures. Al Capone himself was known to fund high-end billiard tables in his Chicago establishments, not just for show, but because he genuinely found joy in knocking a few balls around. He also hated to lose. This, unfortunately, led to a regrettable incident involving a cue ball and a trumpet player's shoes. But we digress. You see, in their quieter hours, gangsters enjoyed the softer trappings of leisure. Games that didn't require Tommy guns or getaway cars. Shuffleboard, cribbage, chess, even dominoes. Not because they were trying to be quaint, but because a quiet mind is a strategic one. And these were men who always had a plan. Picture this. Louis Two Nichols Savarese, a man known for hijacking delivery trucks so efficiently that not even the milkman knew they'd been robbed, carefully sliding a shuffle puck across a polished wooden board while softly humming Ain't Misbehavin'. His opponent, a lanky figure they called Sticks, stroked his chin with a theatrical sigh, calculating his shot as though he were solving a philosophy riddle. So, Two Nichols whispered, if I knock yours off, I get the 10, you get the goose egg. Sticks nodded. That's the math, unless you're bribing the puck. Two Nichols chuckled. Only bribe politicians, my friend. Pucks got no pockets. Moments like these were more common than you'd think in the underworld. They weren't all heists and hideouts. In fact, many shared a fondness for cigar smoke, jazz records, and playful rivalry. The kind where insults were doled out in rhyming couplets or obscure references to Tammany Hall. And then there were the private retreats. Gangsters with enough clout or cash often had cozy little hideaways in the countryside. Not massive hideouts with secret tunnels and crocodile moats, mind you, but modest cabins with soft chairs, card tables worn smooth by hours of poker, and shelves stocked with Prohibition-defying liquor. There, under the lazy sway of ceiling fans and the chirp of crickets just outside the screen doors, men who had orchestrated million-dollar rackets would sit in slippers, drink from enamel mugs, and argue about the best way to plant tomatoes. Dutch Schultz fancied himself an unofficial horticulturist. He once spent an entire summer trying to grow prize-winning sunflowers. No one had the heart to tell him they were technically weeds. And then you had Vincent the Quiet Knife Moretti, whose moniker sounded dangerously sharp until you learned he got it for cutting pies with artful precision at his sister's bakery. He played the mandolin on quiet nights at the lakeside cottage, softly twanging lullabies to no one in particular, while his brother brewed contraband whiskey in the woodshed. The myth of the always angry, always armed gangster misses the quiet truth. Many of them, once away from the club lights and the police radars, simply wanted to sip, sit, and let the night pass unbothered. Gangster leisure wasn't always about roaring applause or fast-living flash. Often, it was a soft pack of cards, the tap of a shuffleboard puck, and the hum of ragtime playing from a gramophone someone bought with a name they weren't born with. And maybe, somewhere in the haze of cigar smoke and moonlight, a man would look around the room at the crinkled eyes of old friends and think, just for a moment, that all this was enough. Now, let your mind rest like a puck stopped near the 10-point zone. Next, we'll drift gently into quieter territory still. A world of bathtub gin, but not the kind you're thinking of. The speakeasies of the 1920s, those hushed little hideaways behind butcher shops, beneath soda parlors, and through coat closets with suspiciously thick doors, are usually painted as dens of danger and decadence. But what if I told you that, once the Tommy guns were checked at the door and the passwords whispered past velvet bouncers, many of the most notorious gangsters of the Roaring Twenties were, well, remarkably domesticated. Picture it. Somewhere in the smoky belly of Chicago, beneath the never-silent rattle of the L train, there's a speakeasy bathed in amber lamplight. The jazz trio is warming up, saxophone like warm molasses, piano played with that sort of sleepy brilliance that requires both gin and a troubled upbringing. And at a corner table, leaning back in booths with scalloped pleats and 2 soft cushions, sit 5 men with more nicknames than fashion sense. Edward Big Smiley Riccobono, wearing suspenders that had clearly retired 5 years ago, but were still on active duty. Next to him is Leo the Spoon Moretti, named not for doing time, but for possessing a suspiciously enthusiastic interest in antique silverware. There's also Frankie Naps Valentino, who, despite being feared across 3 boroughs, is widely known for taking serene, unbothered naps in the middle of high-stakes conversations. The last 2 at the table are silent for now, Frankie, too tall, short for nothing ironically, and Reggie Clockhands McHale, whose punctuality would be admired by Swiss watchmakers and ignored by everyone else. What are these savage icons of crime doing, you ask? Playing canasta? That's right, canasta. Because crime may be thrilling, but nothing soothes the soul like obscure Argentinian-born card games, played over stale biscotti and bootleg limoncello. Gangsters were, understandably, men of high tension, and when off-duty from operations ranging from rum running to less savoury endeavours, their bodies ached. For music, yes, but mostly for routine, for rituals, and for the deeply human pastime of friendly competition. And I say friendly in the way you'd call a cat friendly, elegantly indifferent until provoked. In these little midnight salons, the games were half strategy, half therapy. They'd deal cards with the precision of a robber cracking a vault, sip bathtub gin martinis, and argue for 20 minutes about whether a queen beats a king in Rummy Royale, which isn't even how the game works. The arguments may have sounded heated, but they were just theatre. Delicate, oddly affectionate combat disguised as complaints over the draw pile. Sometimes there were prizes, cigars, pocket knives, or occasionally a pet rooster. Don't ask, no one's quite sure where Frankie Too Tall got it. Other times, the game was reward enough. A few precious hours of being just a guy in rolled-up shirt sleeves, winning or losing cards, with no feds behind the curtain or rivals in the shadows. And we mustn't forget the music. Oh, the music. While jazz was the lifeblood of speakeasy culture, it was also, oddly enough, a sort of lullaby for hardened men. Artists like Bix Beiderbecke and Louis Armstrong weren't merely entertainment. They were atmosphere, mood, balm. There's something inherently softening about a muted trumpet on a Wednesday night, especially when your day job involves coercing rival bootleggers with a tire iron. Musicians, by the way, were often safer than the mayor. Gangsters had a peculiar reverence for talent. Jazz men could waltz right past a room full of brewing tension, nod at Frankie naps, and be given a cut of the night's earnings in exchange for just one more number. No amount of extorted rent paid better than hot clarinet licks at 2 a.m. in Brooklyn. But for all of this decadent leisure, most gangsters still followed strange little personal codes. Some refused to drink on Sundays. Others refused to gamble more than they could recite backwards while tipsy. There were even a few infamous enforcers who moonlighted as amateur poets, composing vague sonnets to dames who'd walked away, or cars that never quite started on the first crank. They weren't necessarily good poems, but they were heartfelt and typed on creaky old typewriters with jammed E keys and undersized ribbon ink. This was how they rested. This was how they recharged for a world that didn't allow softness in daylight. And that, dear listener, is perhaps the most curious contradiction of all. That men who made hard decisions by day found solace in soft rituals by night. Now let your thoughts drift, like saxophone notes scattering across a quiet alley. Let yourself sink into the amber glow warmth of an illegal card game full of clumsy metaphors and quiet understanding. While just above, the city pulses onward, unaware. And as the last hand of the night is dealt, and the laughter fades to contented murmurs, perhaps we might peek in on another curious indulgence, just around the corner. While it's easy to imagine 1920s gangsters as permanently glued to Tommy guns and shady back alleys, the truth is far more melodic. These notorious figures weren't immune to the irresistible spell of syncopated rhythms, crooning saxophones, and the richly perfumed hum of a speakeasy dance floor. Yes, between bootlegging operations and creative accounting, America's most wanted often found themselves swaying gently beneath chandeliers, rough-edged silhouettes softened by candlelight and jazz. There's something almost poetic about it. Picture a man known on police blotters simply as Big Vinny, a robust fellow whose hat size bordered on its own zip code, tapping his foot with remarkable elegance to Ain't Misbehavin', while sipping something definitely not grape juice from a cut glass tumbler. His business partner, Slim Jimmy, a man who was neither, leaned slightly off rhythm beside him, concentrating very seriously on understanding swing. Jazz, you see, was more than music. It was atmospheric camouflage. It offered color and culture to an otherwise monochrome underworld, and it helped that nearly every speakeasy worth whispering about had a jazz band playing 5 to 7 nights a week, not counting matinees for merrier mobsters. The proprietors of these illegal lounges had a flair for ambience, especially if they were mob-funded. Murals of exotic locales were painted on the walls with paint so fresh it may still have been drying. Dim lighting, supplied by mistrustful chandeliers and flickering sconces, cast every guest in flattering noir shades. And the drinks, crude elixirs of bathtub gin or Canadian whiskey smuggled in inside potato sacks, were served in wide-legged glasses clinking gently beneath leopard print tablecloths. Here, gangsters let loose, not just physically, though the Charleston was attempted, often disastrously, by men whose suits weighed more than their dates. No, they let down the psychological guard that usually accompanied a life run on rivalries and whiskey-soaked gambits. These were the places where secrets were accidentally spilled, deals were quietly inked, and bullets were, mercifully, left at the door, if only for an hour or two. Many infamous figures became patrons of the arts, unintentionally birthing an odd sort of gangster gourmet scene. Al Capone himself was something of a closet jazz enthusiast. The man ordered hits with the same decisiveness he used to order trumpet solos. He kept a band on standby in several of his clubs and allegedly tipped more if the clarinetist played Stardust. That's right. Public Enemy #1 had a soft spot for sentimental ballads. In the lilt of a Torch song, even the hardest, criminals found moments of gentle self-reflection or, at the very least, some temporary ear pleasure before bedtime. And though they rarely danced, stiff knees concealed weapons, and pride rarely encouraged it, they watched with a kind of gruff romance in their eyes. Some said there was no negotiating with these men. Others said you might get a better deal if they'd already heard 3 verses of Sweet Georgia Brown. The club scenes didn't just offer entertainment either. They offered a safer forum for intergang diplomacy. Sharing a table in a neutral speakeasy, the Squealing Parrot, say, or Fat Rosie's Ragtime Retreat, often allowed rival figures to clink glasses with only marginal risk of attempted homicide. If nothing else, it was considered profoundly impolite to start a shootout before the last set. And lest you think these establishments were all sweat and crime, remember, one needed a password just to get in. Pineapple upside-down cake, for instance, might open a hidden panel behind a soup kitchen. Uncle Lester's pancakes run late in May could summon a huffing doorman from a trapdoor beneath a statue of Benjamin Franklin. Entry was a reward in itself, like stumbling into Narnia, but with more saxophone. Of course, the jazz clubs weren't all relaxation and reverie. There were arguments, always, in hushed corners, and the occasional card game would erupt into a chorus of selective amnesia. But these moments flickered like candlelight, not bonfires. What lingered longer in memory were the velvety notes of a trumpet solo, weaving through thick cigar smoke, and the momentary illusion of grandeur. And regardless of how hard their lives were by daylight, once night fell and the music began, even Chicago's coldest criminals became something softer along the edges. After all, who among us hasn't felt a bit more human with a highball in hand and a little piano in the background? Now, if you're still awake, let your eyelids drift while the saxophone plays on in your dreams. Because next, we step out into the quiet countryside, where some gangsters found an even stranger kind of peace. Somewhere in a dim corner of Chicago, under the yellowish hum of an electric lamp and the perpetual creak of an upstairs floorboard, a lesser-known member of the Torrio crew could often be found drinking warm milk and playing the mandolin. His name, irrelevant. He changed it every week. But tonight, he is Tony the Turtleneck something or other, and his pastime is not murder or bookkeeping. it's mending socks. Yes, dear listener, when the Tommy guns were locked in the closet and the speakeasies quieted to a whisper, many a vintage gangster found great comfort in the most peculiar of hobbies. Far from the glamour and cigarette haze, these men in pinstripe suits didn't always chase dames and danger. Sometimes they crocheted. Let's dim the lights of the imagination and saunter slowly now into the hush of mobster leisure time, where crime takes a tea break and hardened hearts soften over lemon biscotti. You see, by day, the Roaring Twenties mobster may have been a rum-running, bribe-giving, jazz-fueled chaos agent. But by night, he might be found tending to his rooftop pigeons in a lovingly patched smoking jacket. The ritual was tender. Seed pellets carefully measured into a dish. Names like Sal and Little Peppino murmured to fluffy heads. The birds didn't judge how many bootleggers he'd kneecapped that morning. They just cooed, and that felt nice. Another gangster leisure favorite? Bowling. Ah yes, the quiet clatter of pins, the questionable fashion choices, the joy of a well-oiled ball trajectory. It was a sport tailor-made for unwinding. Several Chicago crews were said to have gentlemen bowling nights, an excuse, yes, for under-the-table negotiations, but also a very real competition to claim ownership of an engraved pineapple-shaped trophy named Strike Capone. Picture 4 men, thick-necked and wide-ankled, arguing over lane etiquette while quietly sipping illegal orange cream soda from flasks tucked in their bowling bags. But perhaps most charming of all were the gangsters who took up poetry. Yes, poetry. Prohibition made everyone hungry, for cash, for booze, and surprisingly for sonnets. Bits of old notebooks have turned up, water-damaged and scrawled with verse, tucked behind floorboards or stuffed in desk drawers. One poem, attributed to a low-ranking numbers man known only as Benny the Latch, includes the tear-inducing line, "Gin behind the shoe store wall, your lips taste of springtime alcohol." Truly, Shakespeare trembles. Still, the most unexpected form of gangster relaxation? Cat rescue? Yes. More than a few organized crime figures found themselves eternally adopted by alley cats. You see, when your nights are long and your schedule is highly illegal, it helps to have someone who doesn't ask questions and purrs when you're home. Cats, naturally suspicious and quick to disappear, are perfect companions for men who also tend to vanish during police raids. New York wasn't far behind. In the shadow of Broadway, some enforcers would spend their off hours taking dance lessons. Rumor has it that one man, known only as Mitz Malone, nailed a perfect Charleston after just 2 weeks of practice. Not because he enjoyed it, oh no. He simply wished to impress a lady librarian who mistook him for an accountant. Knowing how to pivot turns out to be a valuable skill both in life and in murder trials. And don't underestimate a mobster's love of crossword puzzles. The speakeasy back room often housed more than gin. It was also where bruisers huddled over Sunday puzzles, grimacing not from violence, but from realizing they'd misspelled chrysanthemum with a Q. Jigsaw puzzles, too, had loyal fans, especially when you could shake the box menacingly at anyone who refused to find edge pieces first. Now, as your mind begins to drift like pipe smoke in a quiet alley under moonlight, imagine the wide, pinstriped figure of a man leaning back in his creaky armchair, his shoes off, his feet in a tin basin of warm water, a lavender-scented face mask on his nose. He's not planning hits tonight. No, he's trying to learn embroidery from an instruction booklet he liberated from a nun's purse. His stitches are crooked, his fingers clumsy, But for the first time all week, he's at peace. And so we leave them for now, those secret soft souls under their fedoras, sipping chamomile and cursing knotty yarn, their typewriters tucked behind false walls, their cats curled against illicit ledgers. Next, we shall glide gently into the one and only event that drew every gangster out of their leisure lairs. A certain extravagant birthday party involving no less than 3 magicians and a highly suspicious cake. While popular imagination paints a picture of gangsters perpetually hunched over smoky card tables, muttering in gravelly voices while counting their ill-gotten dollars, the reality, at least during their downtime, was often far more bewildering and, dare we say, horticultural. Yes, dear sleepy listener, tonight we're stepping into the clandestine courtyards and rooftop gardens of the 1920s underworld. Quiet little patches of green tended by men who wore pinstripes to prune petunias and tucked pistols beneath their pansy beds. Scarface was no stranger to a rosebush. Now, to be clear, we're not saying Chicago's most feared bootlegger was fussing with fertilizer every morning while humming old Italian lullabies, though it paints a deliciously dreamy picture. But Al Capone did love his leisure as much as he adored imported silk, and while brutal by day, Capone by twilight was an aficionado of soft jazz, wafting through ivy-covered patios, cigar smoke curling skyward like lullabies whispered in ash. Capone's Palm Island estate in Miami, for instance, wasn't just a palatial hideaway, it was practically a Mediterranean Eden. The crown jewel of its landscaping was a curved stone terrace overlooking a lush, terraced garden, sprouting hibiscus, fruit trees, and elegantly strategic hedges, the latter said to serve the dual purpose of beautification and keeping federal agents confused about where the koi pond ended and the secret dock began. And Capone was not alone. Benny Bugsy Siegel was enchanted by the aesthetics of European formal gardens, especially after his flirtations with old-world design during his visits to posh Hollywood hideaways. Bugsy is often remembered for his role in building Las Vegas, but before the neon, he was rather enamored with fountains, rose trellises, and something called a good, structured lemon topiary. His Los Angeles bungalow boasted a rose garden tended by a retired vaudevillian boxer named Hank, who could knock a man out cold or gently whisper encouragement to a struggling Daisy with equal tenderness. Now let's not forget the lesser-known, yet utterly charming practice of garden gin hours among some gangster circles, particularly in Detroit. After all, where there is horticulture, there is usually homemade bootleg liquor hidden behind the hydrangeas. Gangsters and their wives would don dapper linen, set up mismatched chairs in modest backyard gardens, and sip gin from teacups while listening to phonograph records of Rudy Valle. These evenings, often hosted by the more genteel members of organized crime, were not loud affairs. Instead, they featured a curious blend of Midsummer Night's Dream meets organized racketeering. One could almost imagine Oberon handing out hush money. In New York City, rooftop gardens were all the rage, and not just for the law-abiding elite. The more discreet mob families transformed flat, tar paper-top tenement buildings into floral hideaways decked with string lights, canvas tents, and potted olive branches. Perhaps they were longing for Sicily under the stars, or perhaps it was just cool up there, and no one could overhear whispers of their next big score. Rooftop gardens served many purposes. They were meeting spots, serene havens, and, in one peculiar case, a makeshift archery range, though that ended when Jimmy No Aim Montelli sent an arrow through a neighboring chimney and received coal dust as a reply. Often lit with lanterns and veiled in music and moonlight, rooftop gatherings were tiny utopias for people whose daily lives teetered on the edge of chaos. Even John Torrio, Capone's mentor and an early architect of the Chicago outfit, was said to have met with his associates in a trellised courtyard behind his Italian restaurant, where gladiolus provided the perfect screen and fresh celery from the garden made its way into martinis served with alarming frequency. To most, these scenes may seem like contradictions. Hardened gangsters embracing geraniums, mob bosses serenaded by crickets, not courtroom gavels. But that's the nature of history, isn't it? It seldom behaves. Even in the most dangerous ranks of the underworld, the human yearning for beauty, be it in a flower or a fountain, often blooms. And so, nestled quietly between whispered transactions and footfalls in speakeasy basements, there were the clinks of gardening shears, the scent of lavender, and the sound of reluctant laughter through summer leaves. So rest easy now, and let the image of Scarface trimming a hedge by moonlight take root in your dreams. And when we return, we'll slip inside the plush interiors of those gangster reading clubs. Yes, reading clubs, where bullets gave way to book clubs, and criminal minds pondered Mark Twain. Even the most feared crime boss needs a soft place to land at the end of the day. A sanctuary where fedoras are hung beside the door and Tommy guns are traded for thick socks and a good glass of bourbon. In the quiet glow of the 1920s, moonlight, as city sirens echoed off brick alleyways and Model Ts rattled down cobbled lanes, America's gangsters were lighting cigars and slipping, quite literally, into something more comfortable. And thus tonight, we peek beneath the pinstriped veneer and enter the often overlooked oddly tender world of gangster leisure wear. You see, Al Capone may have been the headliner of headlines, but in the comfort of his suite at the Lexington Hotel, Scarface was known to relax in a rather extravagant silk dressing gown embroidered with his monogram. Because really, what is absolute power for, if not to lounge regally in embroidered silk, like a crime lord turned boudoir Roman emperor? Though brooding in black and white photos, many of these mobsters lived lives steeped in color. Salvatore Lucky Luciano reportedly had a penchant for Italian tobacco, lavender cologne, and, curiously, sentimental poetry. He didn't publish, of course, but it's whispered he dabbled in rhymed verse after a few glasses of Chianti, because nothing says racketeering kingpin like a heart that occasionally longs to rhyme. Now, let's head west, not to escape the heat of the law, but the literal heat of summer, as many bootleggers would retreat to lakeside cottages in Wisconsin or upstate New York. Beneath canopies of whispering trees and tucked under plaid blankets, they fished, and not metaphorically. They genuinely liked fishing. There was something soothing about bobbers dancing on a still lake, even for men whose daily lives were less about tranquility and more about territory disputes and cement footwear. When not fishing, they played cards, but not always high-stakes poker or illicit gambling rings. Sometimes, gin rummy. That gentlest card game of bickering grandfathers and rainy day summers had nestled quite comfortably into the hearts of men who otherwise made livings by tossing rivals into riverbeds. Gin rummy games could stretch for hours, occasionally punctuated by long, philosophical pauses, probably involving whiskey and something muttered about loyalty. And then, the most scandalously wholesome pastime of all, reading. Yes, despite the air of hardened menace, these were men with nightstands cluttered by more than just handguns and Tommy magazines. Crime papers, yes, but also dime store novels, westerns, detective stories, and even the occasional F. Scott Fitzgerald, though quietly, since admitting affection for the beautiful and damned didn't exactly bolster your street cred in Cicero. A few even fancied themselves bohemians at heart. It's said that Dutch Schultz once tried to write a screenplay. It was never finished, stalled somewhere between an artful love scene in a speakeasy and 4 consecutive pages of what can only be described as jazz-fueled car chases. Of course, there were the pets. Many gangsters, beneath their polished brass knuckles and cocky scowls, had a weakness for soft, fluffy things that didn't talk back. George Bugs Moran reportedly had a pair of Boston Terriers who dressed better than most tax-paying citizens, complete with satin collars and once, allegedly, a dog-sized dinner jacket. Capone had a fondness for canaries. Johnny Torrio had cats, big, purring, long-haired Persians that lounged like royalty on his expensive divans, scattered with ash from his endless cigars. It might be said the only thing harder than confrontations with rival gangs was keeping a white Persian's fur impeccable during a whiskey raid. And in the background of all this slow, smoky domesticity, the radio played blues, jazz, the crackle of announcers describing baseball games in voices that curled like warm soup across the airwaves. Gangsters loved baseball. They even sponsored teams. The Chicago outfit had its own local club, mostly made of neighborhood boys lucky enough to swing a bat better than a blackjack. Games were relaxed affairs. A little gambling, a few cigars, occasionally a bribe or two, but mostly cucumbers and sunshine, watched from the third baseline by men with names like Frankie the Weasel or Tony Bananas. It was, for all its danger and drama, an oddly human scene. Beneath the brass-buttoned bravado beat the hearts of men who pressed by day, dreamed softer dreams by night, of fishing rods and baseball mitts, of canaries and card games and novels half finished. In moments like those, even the roughest bootlegger might have stared out the window at the moon and wondered if a quieter life was ever in the cards. But of course the cards had already been dealt, and so tomorrow, or maybe even just later that night, the phone would ring, a speakeasy would buzz with code phrases, a rival would encroach, and our gentlemen rogues would slip off their robes, holster their resolve, and return to the streets. But tonight they were readers, dog whisperers, poets grumbling into their scotch, dreamers suspended softly in time. Next, we'll slip into the soft shadows of jazz clubs, where even the roughest mob enforcer might find himself unexpectedly enchanted by a trumpet's lonely note and the sway of a sequined stranger. While the public thrilled at tales of Tommy guns, bootlegged bourbon, and sharply dressed men with sharper reputations, there existed a quieter, fuzzier side to the underworld, one not advertised in newspapers nor whispered about in smoky barrooms. For beneath their pinstripe bravado and steely glares, many a 1920s gangster harbored a tender fondness for animals. Yes, dear listener, pets. Small, fluffy, feathery, and sometimes scaly companions that shared the free time of America's bootlegging big shots. And perhaps nothing is cozier than imagining a notorious crime boss snoozing in an armchair with a purring cat curled up on his lap, while a henchman carefully reads aloud the funnies. Let's drift backward to a glittery, piano-drenched decade where loyalty wasn't just bought, it sometimes wagged its tail. One of the more overlooked truths about the Jazz Age's criminal elite is that many of them lived in constant fear, not from rivals or the law, although certainly those too, but of betrayal from within. Trust was harder to come by than a drinkable cup of bathtub gin. So who could you confide in without risking your life, your money, or your hideout? Simple. A dog. A good boy, possibly named Lucky. But not too lucky. He wouldn't want to upstage Luciano. Take, for instance, Oni the Killer Madden, a man known for his violent temper, his control over Harlem's nightlife, and his shockingly well-behaved cockatoo, Percival. Percival, though never officially indicted, was said to have greeted guests at Madden's front door with a polite, "Hello, you mug." Some say the bird once barked out the entire lyrics to Sweet Georgia Brown from memory, though critics claimed he had pitch problems in the bridge. The speakeasies themselves, often thought of as dens of jazz, gin, glamour and gawking, also became secret shelter for more pause than anyone realized. In Chicago, there were at least two well-known establishments, Paddy's Velvet Den and the Gilded Peach, where the proprietor's bulldog roamed freely among the guests, pausing only for scratches and the occasional dropped meatball. Nothing defused tension between rival gangs quite like a chubby French bulldog waddling through a sit-down meeting and licking someone's boot. Of course, cats reigned supreme in the quieter quarters. They were the unofficial mascots of the ledger keepers, the hideout dwellers, and particularly the moonshiners, who appreciated the feline flair for knocking over bottles and sitting in boxes. Legend has it that in one upstate New York distillery, hidden among a cluster of geese and far too many barrels, there lived a tabby named Vinnie Jr., who could sense police raids 15 minutes before they happened. Or so the tale goes. Vinnie Jr. would reportedly leap onto the still and yowl in a high-pitched squawk just before the rustle of leaves announced a Prohibition agent tumbling through the brush. Some say he was just hungry. Others say he was the reincarnated soul of a former rum runner with unfinished business. Even more amusing, some gangsters didn't limit their affections to traditional pets. There are semi-believable accounts of Maxie the Dove Feldman, a minor associate of Dutch Schultz, who kept a rather large and poorly behaved ferret named Buttons. Buttons was well known around parts of the Lower East Side for thieving shoelaces and disappearing into patrons' trousers. His legacy was one of equal parts horror and hilarity. And while hard evidence is patchy, some of it likely eaten by Buttons, the pet trend wasn't merely a personal comfort. It became a subtle sign of softness, a quiet way to romanticize danger. It's not every criminal feared by City Hall who also hand-feeds caviar to a Maine Coon named Blanche. In their free time, these anti-heroes of the era didn't only drink and gamble. They combed their poodles, trained pigeons, and sometimes, only sometimes, took their turtles out for walks on strings. So as the jazz hums low and the smoke curls from the last cigar, it's oddly comforting to know that even the darkest figures sometimes needed to scratch behind a soft ear or share a bit of steak under the table with a trusted companion who never testified. The underworld, it turns out, is full of purring. And as we draw the velvet curtain on our softest chapter yet, we slide gently now into another shadowed corner of the 1920s, a special retreat where secrets were stamped carefully and scandal stuck under the tongue like a sugar cube. Even the most fearsome gangsters had to put their feet up sometimes. After all, no one can smuggle bootleg whiskey and bribe the occasional police sergeant from dawn till dusk without some leisure in between. And so, beneath the whiskey-slick glow of chandeliered speakeasies, or in the smoky back rooms of tailor shops that didn't quite tailor, gangsters of the Roaring Twenties indulged in one of their favorite pastimes, cards. Now, when you picture a gangster's game night, you might imagine a tense poker table, revolvers nestled within suspiciously heavy coat pockets, and everyone cheating everyone with quiet, elegant menace. And you'd only be half wrong. The card games themselves were very real and very serious. Poker did reign supreme, particularly draw and stud, but other games made appearances too. Pinnacle, for example, was surprisingly beloved among aging mafiosi who preferred a more dignified duel of wits. Then there was blackjack, played with varying degrees of understanding, depending on how well the players could still count after their third glass of bathtub gin. But if the games were serious, the settings were mischievously theatrical. Let's step now into one of these cozy layers of iniquity. The lighting, dim enough to make a man look handsomer and his card hand vaguer. The air, dense with cigar smoke, and tail taller than the Empire State Building's eventual spire. The furniture, velvet chairs that sighed under the weight of men who knew what it meant to gamble on friendship and profit alike. And in the center of it all, the card table, an altar of unholy camaraderie, bore ashtrays, glasses clinking with amber-colored hope, and decks so well handled they nearly melted at the touch. The thing about gangster game nights is that they weren't just about the money. Sure, thousands of dollars could exchange hands before midnight, half of which might vanish again on bad whiskey or ill-conceived real estate schemes. But mostly, it was about something softer, unwinding in a world where being permanently tense was just part of the job description. After all, it's hard to talk business when your pocket is bugged or your rival is busy hiding behind a potted fern. So instead, they played cards. They bickered about rules everyone agreed on last week. They called each other cheaters with the affectionate spite of old brothers. They puffed through Cuban cigars like they were burning last week's stress, and maybe a little evidence. Jokes flowed as freely as gin, and stories were told in half-truths flavored with bravado, like the one about Fat Tony, who once claimed he'd won a 3-story brownstone over a hand of 5-card stud, then covered up the fact that the deed was written on a napkin from Katz's delicatessen. Or the time when Dutch Schultz lost a full night's winnings and cheerfully blamed it on a ghost what knew how to bluff. In these sacred spaces, rules bent like taffy. Sometimes bullets were exchanged, but more often, just barbs and good-natured threats. It was a curious contradiction. These were men capable of ruthless violence, yet in a room of smoke and laughter, they revealed something startlingly mundane. They were, as much as one dared say, people with favorite card chairs, lucky cufflinks, and rules about not talking politics at the table unless you brought blackjack gum. You see, despite the tough exteriors and rum-running reputations, many of these men longed for somewhere quiet to lower the mask, a place to lean back, sip from a chipped glass, and complain about their brother-in-law without fearing a wiretap. Even Al Capone, who surely didn't send holiday cards to the IRS, was said to be fond of a relaxed evening game. He allegedly preferred rummy, a game of building sequences and throwing away disappointments, which is perhaps a poetic reflection of life in organized crime. His cards were usually held close, and his opponents were usually relatives. Better to keep the cheating in the family. The card table, then, was more than leisure. It was a strategy meeting in disguise, a therapy session conducted behind bluffing eyes, and a place where reputations, debts, and jokes were traded with equal gravity. A masculine theatre of controlled risk, no shootouts, just hearts, clubs, and unpredictable kings. And as the night stretched onward and the jazz wound down to a murmured fondness in the background, cigars burnt to nubs, winnings were pocketed into polyester slacks, and the gangsters rose one by one, some to return to business, some to fall asleep in under-ventilated apartments, some possibly to pace the roof and wonder why every ace feels lucky until it's the last card you draw. And speaking of places where luck and leisure intertwine, let's gently drift to another surprising pastime these silver-tongued smugglers indulged in. A rather refined activity involving roses, dirt, and the most elegant of criminal green thumbs. By the late 1920s, with Prohibition still staggering forward like a tipsy giraffe in tap shoes, gangsters had done quite a lot of shooting, smuggling, swearing, and statement-making in hats. But sometimes, even men who'd muscled their way into bourbon empires through brass knuckles and bootleg gin liked a quiet evening, a soft chair, a saxophone solo that sounded like melted butter rolling down velvet stairs. And thus, we come to their lesser-known pursuits, not involving fedoras flung across poker tables or enemies buried beneath speakeasy floorboards, but evenings spent in jazz clubs, garden parties, and chicken breeding competitions. Yes, really. Now don't worry, no actual jazz cats were involved. But back then, if you were a hep cat, you were either very into rhythms syncopated by scandal, or you were simply trying to avoid being square. Gangsters loved jazz, not just for its sound, which could glide from a whisper to a riot in 32 bars, but because it had the same origin story as their own ambitions. Born in the back streets, raised in rebellion, and dressed in sequins by midnight, New York's Cotton Club, for example, was a favorite haunt. Owned by bootlegger Oni Madden, who had precisely the face of a man both hugged and feared by neighborhood grandmothers, the club showcased legends like Duke Ellington and Cab Calloway. While the audience sipped cola, suspiciously fizzy and possibly flammable, men with knuckle-duster smiles listened with their eyes closed, letting trumpets tell them stories they'd never dare say aloud. But jazz wasn't the only way to unwind. Oh no. Some gangsters became truly domestic creatures of habit when the moon was high and the Tommy guns were in the closet. Al Capone himself was a devoted baseball fan and amateur banjo player. That's right. The man known as Scarface would strum away on his 4-string banjo in private moments, plucking folk melodies and maybe humming something soft while lost in thought. It's tempting to imagine Capone at twilight, sitting in silk pajamas with a sheet mask on, plinking a rendition of Camptown Races. Speaking of sports, some gangsters found their balance on the golf course, a place where the most dangerous thing isn't a gunfight, but gently misjudging the wind on the back nine. Golf offered smooth green vistas, polite competition, and excellent networking opportunities. After all, when your accountant needs to launder 5 figures through a seafood restaurant, you might as well discuss it over 18 holes and 2 cigars. Other gangsters preferred gardening. Not something you'll find in most gritty noir films, but then again, tomatoes don't dig themselves. Home gardening was surprisingly common among mob families, especially the older generation who preferred basil to bullets. There are whispers that some retired guns for hire competed ferociously at local horticulture contests under pseudonyms like Tony Greenthumb or Petunia Pete. Who knew turf wars could also involve actual turf? One frequently overlooked pastime was cinema. With the rise of silent films and the earliest talkies, some gangsters fancied themselves film connoisseurs. In private, screening rooms, a luxury few could afford unless they'd recently acquired a rival's assets. Mob bosses would critique Greta Garbo performances or discuss Charlie Chaplin's comedic timing. Very funny, one might mutter, swirling a bootlegged Manhattan. But he reminds me too much of Frankie the Squeak, you know, with the mustache. For the artistically inclined, there was also painting. A handful of low-level mobsters indulged this gentle hobby, splashing watercolors on heavy paper while waiting for their evening assignments. Their works rarely survived. Too many ended up as kindling during unpleasant misunderstandings. But for a brief moment, the brutality paused, and mauve-streaked sunsets shimmered on canvas. Social clubs, well, the legitimate kind, were another realm of quiet escape. Not every clubhouse was a front for gambling and whiskey. Some were just clubs, bench seating, domino games, and safe, slightly overdone meatballs. Talk of family, fishing, war stories, and who made the best sauce. It was therapeutic, in a gravy-based way. And at day's end, many just wanted to be dads or uncles, or the guy who didn't miss Sunday dinner. That image might be hard to reconcile with stories of concrete shoes and warehouse ambushes. But in reality, people contain multitudes, even ones with nicknames like Sluggo or Teeth. The Roaring Twenties roared not just in the streets, but in hearts yearning for stillness. And sometimes, that stillness wore slippers and held a crossword puzzle. Now, as we tiptoe onward, let's step inside one of these clubs. Not the glamorous ones under neon moonlight, but the coziest kind, where the boss plays checkers with a cousin and nobody dares cheat. Make yourself comfortable. Chapter 17 awaits. You may think that a gangster's leisure involved dimly lit poker tables, clouds of cigar smoke, and suspicious briefcases underfoot. And you'd be absolutely right, some of the time. But what history tends to brush aside, like an inconvenient feather boa at a speakeasy swing dance, is that sometimes, even the meanest mobster needed a croquet break. Truly, nothing says organized crime like organized sports, particularly the deceptively gentle chaos of early 20th century party games. By the mid-1920s, Prohibition had turned Chicago's underbelly into a field ripe with blast-proof offices, hidden doors, and an endless stream of false mustaches. But on Sunday afternoons, and sometimes on Tuesdays, if gunfire happened to delay plans, certain members of the underworld could be found on the lawns of tastefully acquired suburban mansions, engaging in surprisingly spirited games. Croquet, with its dainty mallets and innocent hoops, became quite the unexpected pastime among the top hats and Tommy guns crowd. Al Capone himself was rumored to have hosted a croquet championship during a lull in the federal indictments. Witnesses described it as civilized, save for the occasional threat to replace someone's shin bones with a piano leg. It's worth noting, dear listener, that playing croquet was sometimes double-coded language used in illicit scheduling. In certain circles, an offhand reference to powder blue at noon, bring your mallet, was less about wickets and more about whiskey shipments arriving via Canada. But many gangsters actually adored the game. It was social. It was quiet. It didn't involve too much running or risk of sweat-stained suits, something that mattered deeply to a generation of men who thought pinstripes were more important than morals. And this leads us, gently, to the topic of fashion. Because when you're running an illegal empire, your outward appearance is how you convince church ladies to look the other way as you launder coin donations. The Roaring Twenties were not subtle times, fashion-wise. They were about tailoring so sharp it could cut glass, and fedoras perched with mathematical precision. A well-dressed gangster was many things, but above all else, he was an ambassador of denial. He was there to say, "No, officer, I'm just a humble haberdasher," as he buttoned his silk vest over a guilt-ridden heart. The mobster wardrobe was part camouflage, part peacock. Tailors loved them. Every lieutenant, bootlegger, and enforcer had at least one signature suit. Rum runner Rosario Rosie. Petrelli wore paisley ties like they were armor, Dutch Schultz reportedly once paid extra to have the lapels on his jacket sewn with horsehair from his own racing stable. And Legs Diamond, the man owned more shoe polish than a footwear museum during a blackout. They weren't just dressing for show. They were dressing with a purpose. To look so good nobody would believe you were capable of strict felonies. A stylish man, it seemed, was above suspicion. And in the vainer folds of the underworld, fashion became a competition fiercer than any turf war. Hair pomades were traded like stock tips. Cologne recipes were guarded with more secrecy than safe house coordinates. There were whispered arguments over cufflink etiquette, and heaven help the man who wore brown shoes after dusk. One of the more charming, if unusual, traditions of this sartorial obsession was the late-night mirror club, where young, up-and-coming gangsters would gather, not at barbershops or speakeasies, but in each other's apartments to experiment with mustache curvature and lapel pin placement. These sessions were half runways, half rituals. One could be blacklisted from a whole crew for wearing stripes with checks, at least until someone reminded them they were criminals, not couturiers. Of course, not all style choices sailed smoothly. There were fashion tragedies. One particularly ill-fated mobster tried to popularize a fedora made entirely of crushed pearls. He was never seen again, perhaps too embarrassed to show his bejeweled hat in public, or perhaps relocated to New Jersey, which at the time was the preferred retirement village for failed trends. Yet, through it all, the pursuit of elegance remained strangely sincere. Because even in the world of back-alley bootlegging and unregistered firearms, there was something comforting, soothing even, about the crisp snap of your trouser crease, or the slick glide of a well-oiled comb through damp hair. And when your day job involved evading federal agents, bribing city officials, and occasionally ducking bullets, dressing impeccably might have been the only real control you had left. Let your eyes grow heavier now. Imagine the hiss of silk collars at twilight, a croquet ball rolling softly across a suburban lawn, and the whisper of a violent man fixing a perfect Windsor knot. Next, we'll step carefully into the smoky lullabies of gin-fueled jazz clubs, where the underworld danced with a certain scandalous grace. By now, you might be snuggled beneath a blanket that feels more like a cloud than a textile. And if so, that's the perfect attire for tonight's tale of gangsters. At leisure, not in a shootout, not in a speakeasy brawl, but sitting comfortably, perhaps in smoking robes and slippers, surrounded by velvet drapes and the faint scent of hair pomade and pipe smoke. Yes, this chapter is less Tommy gun, more gin rummy. As it turns out, even the most fearsome bootleggers eventually needed to unwind. And how did these criminal capitalists indulge themselves between laundering money and dodging federal agents? With startlingly domestic pastimes, card games chiefly, and not the kind where money flew so fast a man could feel the breeze across his mustache, but the sort that required patience, cigars, and a strong cup of coffee. Al Capone, perhaps the most famously bullet-pointed gangster of the age, adored a good hand of poker, but not for the stakes. He once hosted card nights at his Miami mansion, where the buy-in was low, but the conversation rich. There, under gaslight chandeliers and amid the faint hum of jazz from a record player spinning at a leisurely 78 RPM, Capone would chat about baseball scores and the stock market, though he preferred home runs to Dow Jones numbers. If you're picturing gunmen playing Go Fish with revolvers tucked into their socks, you wouldn't be far off. Card games were more than distraction. They were space for plotting, yes, but also for bonding. Gangsters, like the rest of us, needed community, a place to complain about weather, wives, or federal bans on their favorite bourbons. The choice of games said a lot. Poker was for confidence men and smooth talkers. Bridge for those who like symmetry and subtle domination. And Pinnacle, well, Pinnacle was for the old-timers who didn't mind taking 4 hours to finish what was essentially a complicated argument with points. But it wasn't just cards. Some gangsters, believe it or not, took up chess. Dutch Schultz was said to keep a small wooden chessboard in the glove compartment of his car. He would challenge anyone willing during long stakeouts outside speakeasies. Schultz favored the knight, which he claimed was the only piece brave enough to mess things up and not stick to straight lines. A poetic sentiment from a man known more for tax evasion than tact. And when they weren't playing games, they were listening to them. Games on the wireless, that is. Baseball was the true balm of many a weary mobster. The 1920s were a golden age for the sport, after all. Babe Ruth was sending balls into the stratosphere, and even hardened men with nicknames like Knuckles and Jimmy the Wink could be arrested by nostalgia for the crack of the bat. Imagine Bugsy Siegel stretched out on a plush armchair, a glass of questionable scotch in hand, half listening to the Yankees game on the radio, muttering softly about a missed pitch while contemplating whether the curtains matched the carpet. The guy had opinions. He once paid more for tailored scarves than most men earned in a year. Gangster style, a subject for another dream. Also quietly popular among the criminal elite was one of history's coziest hobbies, birdwatching, though not quite as romantic as it seems. Not because of love of plumage, but because watching who came and went from the skies or from neighboring roofs was a strategic advantage. Still, some did enjoy the company of pigeons more than people. Lucky Luciano famously kept homing pigeons on his rooftop, training them not only for messaging, but because, as he supposedly said, some of them got more loyalty than guys I pay. Games, birds, broadcasts, these were the gentle interludes in otherwise turbulent lives, the spaces where men who trafficked in fear simply acted bored, as if all the plotting and posturing had worn thin, and the only real drama left was whether the ace of spades would finally show its face. Now, speaking of faces, some of these gangsters were fascinated by another sort of game, the art, and possibly the cheat, of facial expressions. Poker-faced? Perhaps. But others trained themselves in micro-expressions to detect lies. A subtle twitch, a raised brow, the way a fellow sniffed before fibbing about a shipment, like lie detectors in wool suits, tomorrow, or whenever sleep decides to let us wake again. We'll visit one such face reader, a man whose smirk was a legal grey area all its own. But for now, let the cards settle, the jazz fade, and drift like smoke into gentler dreams. Picture this. It's a breezy Thursday evening in 1926. On the surface, all is quiet. Just the soft rustle of newspapers on front stoops and the distant purr of a Packard rolling by. But in one particular suite of the Hotel Lexington, a notorious bootlegger known more for gun moles than garlic cloves is, stirring a pot of risotto. That's right. Despite the headlines and holsters, when gangsters clocked out of the underworld, many clocked into the kitchen. It might come as a surprise, but the average Prohibition-era mobster had a surprisingly discriminating palate. Perhaps all that bootlegging made them thirsty for flavor, or perhaps they simply wanted something to do with their hands when they weren't gripping Tommy guns. Either way, feasting, became a nightly ritual as sacred as the numbers racket. Let's start with the undisputed heavyweight of mob dining, Charles Lucky Luciano. Though he made his bones hustling in gambling dens, Luciano had a surprisingly delicate touch when it came to pasta. According to whispered stories passed down by retired waiters and grandnieces alike, Luciano insisted on his spaghetti aglio e olio being simmered low and slow, never rushed, even when bullets were flying on the streets outside. Gangsters, it turns out, were remarkably picky eaters. They weren't just shoveling red sauce down their silk-shirted selves. Oh no, there was pride involved. An Italian-American gangster wouldn't dream of sourcing over store-bought gnocchi. These men rolled pasta like they ran rackets, with precision and a touch of swagger. Beyond the Italians, the Irish mob had their own culinary comforts. Sure, the menu wasn't Epicurean, think more stews and soda bread than fine escargot, but what it lacked in flair, it made up for in heart and an alarming percentage of whiskey butter sauce. In many Irish-run speakeasies, meals were served up family-style, cheek to jowl, with more storytelling than seasoning. It wasn't just about eating, it was about listening, laughing, and very subtly checking your coat for hidden microphones. You might be wondering, were these mobster meals always so luxurious? Not exactly. Many gangsters came from humble beginnings, and their tastes reflected that nostalgia. A bowl of lentil soup might carry more emotional weight than a ledger full of bootlegging profits. A piece of homemade focaccia buttered just right. That was a kind of love language, tougher to counterfeit than any forgery job on Wall Street. The women of the underworld had their say too. Gangster wives, girlfriends, and sometimes mistresses, not that we're keeping score, were often the unsung heroines of these flavor feasts. Take May Capone, Al's long-suffering and long-cooking spouse. It's said her roast chicken could calm a Chicago turf war. She never wielded a bat, but she wielded a basta with battle-hardened precision. And lest we forget the speakeasy chefs, those anonymous saints of sauté, who turned shady basements into the hottest dinner tickets in town. One notable Chicago speakeasy, the Gilded Gnocchi, served veal saltimbocca with a side of hush money. The head chef, Pietro Peter the Pepper Mancini, was beloved more for his marinara than for his brief but dramatic side career as an arsonist. Between sips of bootleg scotch and bites of perfectly charred artichoke hearts, gangsters debriefed the day's misdeeds, swapped underworld gossip, and occasionally broke into soft, off-key renditions of folk songs their mothers used to hum. It was strange, sweet, sideways serenity. Men who commanded drive-bys also cherished time-roasted potatoes. Of course, not every gangster fancied himself the Julia Child of Chicago. Some resorted to takeout, delivered by boys who knew not to ask questions. Others simply stole dinner. One New York enforcer reportedly confiscated a kosher deli's entire corned beef stock because he was having a bad day. But such things were usually forgiven, though certainly not forgotten, over dessert. Ah yes, dessert. Cannoli, tiramisu, crumb cake, and the occasional fruit plate, served with a side of scotch naturally. These sleepy sweets marked the end of long, morally ambiguous days and the beginning of slow, steady dreams. So next time you picture a 1920s mobster, don't just imagine pinstripes and pistols. Imagine velvet slippers, a delicate spoonful of lemon sorbet, and a man named Benny Three Ears with lifelong feelings about Basel. Speaking of feelings, next, we'll slip into something even cozier, the secret hobbies of hitmen with hearts of gold. And hobbies far stranger than you'd think. If you were imagining that rum runners and moles wrapped up their evenings in smoky dens, counting cash and polishing Tommy guns before bed, I regret to inform you, you'd be about a third right and 2/3 deliciously wrong. For tonight, dear listener, tiptoe with me past the jazz clubs and bootlegger hideouts of 1920s Chicago, and let's peek inside the lesser-known and surprisingly fragrant pastime of our well-dressed underworld, leisurely gardening, pajama fashion contests, and yes, a surprising obsession with exotic birds, the things one does when not dodging prohibition agents or bribing a city councilman. Let's begin with the pajamas. Much like a tuxedo was the unofficial uniform of an evening gambler, gangsters took great pride in what they wore to bed. Perhaps it was the influence of the imported Italian silks, or simply their flair for the dramatic. But a surprising number of these tough men had a drawer, if not an entire armoire, dedicated to sleepwear rivaling that of a film star. Al Capone himself reportedly owned a collection of embroidered silk pajamas, lavender being a favored hue. He may have terrorized Chicago by daylight, but by moonlight, he preferred comfort, with a splash of Gatsby-level glamour. Custom monogrammed, naturally. Capone even hosted what some sources affectionately called pajama brunches at his Palm Island estate, where velvet robes fluttered like gangster peacocks, sipping espresso and gossiping about competitors like retired ballet dancers. And speaking of brunch, allow your mind to wander to something softly unexpected. Tomatoes. Not just any tomatoes, but heirloom, non-union tomatoes, planted lovingly in backyard gardens by men with nicknames like Knuckles and Muggsy. You see, some gangsters fancied themselves gentleman farmers by hobby, and nowhere did that collide more fantastically than in their private gardens. Grew their own basil, prided themselves on their cabbages. There are even accounts of Big Jim Colosimo tending roses with a patience rarely seen in his more, shall we say, professional affairs. He pruned his lemon trees with a delicacy that would surprise his rivals, if they ever got the chance to see it. Gardening was not merely an aesthetic choice, it was also symbolic. A man who could grow life, cultivate beauty, and yet do so behind the high hedges of secrecy. Well, that kind of man was feared and admired in equal measure. There were whispered garden contests between rival homes. Sweet potatoes were judged. Peonies were preened. Once, a prize melon grown by a Wisconsin racketeer was transported in a velvet-lined case to Atlantic City. It didn't survive the trip, but the story certainly did. Occasionally, these hobbies turned into full-blown obsessions. Take Joe, the canary zucchino. Not his real last name, but the nickname stuck after his hobby got out of hand. Joe had a downtown apartment covered wall-to-wall with bird cages, parrots, finches, cockatoos that called everyone in the room dollface. Visitors reported a sense of stepping into an aviary, where your host might either serve you prosciutto or shoot at your shoes, depending on how well his blue macaw was performing that day. And while we're on the subject of unexpected, let's whisper about the private poetry of George Gimpy George Tortorello. He limped, he lisped, and he loved Emily Dickinson. Gimpy George may have managed 3 speakeasies and orchestrated an infamous fur heist, but late in the evening, he could often be found reposing in his study, a Turkish coffee in hand, composing soft, somber verses about the moonlight and lost love. He mailed handwritten poems to an anonymous Chicago newspaper column under the pen name E.Z. Thistledown. They were sometimes about mob hits, but metaphorically, with roses and metaphysical clouds. In a world measured in loyalty and territory, it appears that when dusk fell and the streets grew quiet, a surprising number of mobsters just wanted to wear something soft and grow something green. Yes, they were criminals. But even criminals, it seems, drift toward beauty in their off hours. Let that little truth settle over you like a feather-soft comforter. The human desire to find peace, however illegally funded or poetically lopsided, is universal. Now, allow your mind to wander deeper into the warm night, because next, we'll listen to the music that lulled these gangsters to sleep, and maybe learn which lullaby Lucky Luciano found most soothing after a long day of crime. Shh, the roses are dreaming now. Even mobsters got tired of sitting in smoky parlors, tossing cards, and arguing about who forgot to bribe the cop on 5th Street again. Eventually, even the toughest gangster needed to loosen a tie, slip on some dancing shoes, and awkwardly pretend he knew how the Charleston. You see, beneath the surface of roaring engines and Tommy gun click-clacks, there was a gentler, twirlier side to organized crime in the 1920s. It was the era of jazz, of unbuttoned collars, and of clandestine soiree scenes so stylish they might as well have been dipped in moonlight and bathtub gin. Let's dim the lights and drift gently down now, down beneath an innocently creaking bakery in Chicago. Somewhere between the rye dough and the pretzel salt lies an unmarked trapdoor. And if you, dear sleeper, were lucky or insane enough to whisper the password, "Frank sent me and he's low on flour," you'd be led by the elbow into one of the lesser-known joys of gangster downtime, the underground ballroom. Yes, it really was a thing. In the warped funhouse mirror world of Prohibition, gangsters didn't just spend their free time in smoke-filled backrooms counting profits. They organized gala-style parties where rival mobs tangoed cautiously around each other, wary of stepping on both feet and egos. These gatherings were strange little worlds in themselves. Picture-wide mirrored halls hidden beneath hardware stores, humming with jazz bands paid in black market bourbon. Men in pinstripe suits sipped martinis through cigarette smiles, while women in beaded flapper dresses jitterbugged like they had bees in their shoes. One such establishment was colloquially known as the Silver Sock, a private underground lounge owned by a lesser-known associate of Big Jim Colosimo. Silver Sock wasn't named for footwear, but for the shiny, utterly garish wall sconces shaped like, as legends go, a single glittery sock. Classy. Taste may have been optional, but fun was mandatory. Now, it wasn't all fun and dance. Things had rules. These events may have oozed jazz and gin, but they also followed the strictest of mob etiquette. For instance, no weapons allowed on the dance floor. You could check your coat and your sidearm at the same time. Thank you kindly. And rival gangs had to agree to a temporary cease hostility clause for the evening. A truce enforced by an ominously polite man named Earl, who, though he looked like a valet, could disassemble a Tommy gun in 9 seconds flat. Despite all the peace treaties and saxophones, tensions remained as low-key volatile as champagne under pressure. On more than one occasion, the waltz ended in wallops. There's a famous tale of 2 bootleggers from rival New York outfits challenging each other to a tap dance duel. It began with sharp-toed flair and ended in an overturned piano and 3 bruised egos. But for the most part, these nights swayed on, fueled by New Orleans jazz, French 75s, and the curious, gentle camaraderie of criminals who, despite the bullets and bootlegging, just wanted a good old-fashioned foxtrot. The music was often provided by bands that knew how to keep things discreet. Some musicians wore masks, not for anonymity, but to protect their identities from jealous husbands or nosy feds. Legend says one band introduced a song called "You're the Bee's Knees," but the FBI's watching. A hit, naturally. And oh, the dancing. These men of muscle and menace, soft-stepping under chandeliers stolen from a bankrupt casino, trying their best not to step on their partner's toes or feelings. There's something overwhelmingly human about watching hardened gangsters concentrating fiercely to remember which foot to lead with. Even more so when one alphanetic gangster famously tripped mid-rumba and blamed it on that cursed jazz rhythm. Of course, the end of the night came gently, like an old whiskey bottle finally running dry. The last song was always a slow dance. No business talk, just swaying. The kind of moment that made even wise guys wordless. And when it was time to leave, Earl, the polite enforcer, would hand each guest their coat, weapon, and a small chocolate truffle with a folded note that said, "Thanks for not shooting anyone tonight." As the party faded and the trapdoor groaned shut, above ground the sun would begin teasing the skyline, unsuspecting yet again that a criminal cotillion had unfolded just beneath its sleepy city. And as for the gangsters, they'd head home, pockets jingling with stolen hearts and unpaid bar tabs. Some might nap in Model T cars. Others would return to their speakeasies to check if the day's gin shipment arrived unshot. But soon, their leisure would take yet another unexpected turn into something far more cerebral and surprisingly floral. Sleep now, dear listener. Let the music linger. The next page awaits with perfume, pageantry, and prize-winning dahlias, while bootleggers ruled the night with Tommy guns and whispers, and speakeasies danced through the jazz-saturated air of the Roaring Twenties. There existed another, quieter pastime that a surprising number of gangsters indulged in: the fine and often fumbling art of writing. Yes, dear dreamer, beneath the pinstripe suits and the smoke-wreathed bravado, there beat literary hearts, tentative and mysterious. Scribbling secretly by lamplight, some gangsters swapped bullets for metaphors and safe houses for stanzas. If you listen closely to the hum of history, you might still hear the soft tap-tap of a typewriter behind a reinforced door. Consider, for example, the legend of Sal Two Fingers Moretti, who earned his nickname not from a traumatic run-in with a cigar cutter, as one might suspect, but because he insisted on typing with only two fingers, index on the left, middle on the right. Sal fancied himself a writer of mysteries, though his stories were less whodunit and more why so many gunfights in the library. Sal would retreat to the back room of the Blue Lantern Club in Chicago, a thick velvet curtain separating him from the swirling gin fumes and the warbling of a trumpet already too deep into the night. There, he would sit with his Remington typewriter, often rusted, occasionally jammed, and peck away at tales of shadowy detectives who always bore a suspicious resemblance to himself, only with better hair and a slightly more heroic chin. Often, he'd read his scribbles to the bartender before the speakeasy opened. "See, I got this dame. Walks in with trouble painted right on her face. Lipstick too. But that's less important. She's got a secret. It's booze smugglers shaped like nuns." The bartender, polishing a glass for 35 minutes straight, would nod solemnly. Very literary, Sal. Writing, it seems, was more common among career criminals than one might expect. You see, in a world of aliases, coded messages, and double dealings, storytelling was simply second nature. Inventing a believable alibi required the same skills as crafting a compelling protagonist. Someone likable enough to escape scrutiny, but with just enough flaws to keep things interesting. Many gangsters kept journals, not because they had a death wish, but because chronicling one's misadventures in blood and whiskey was, in a way, therapeutic, like some shadowy, noir-stained version of a gratitude diary. Dear Journal, grateful that Big Tiny took the fall for the meat truck job, also managed to enjoy a cannoli uninterrupted, a rare win. And then there was Evelyn Eagle Eyes Russo, a woman of sharp looks and sharper prose. Known for being a top-notch bootleg strategist in Newark, Evelyn also hosted a monthly reading salon, yes, a reading salon, at her townhouse, where underground literati gathered, sipping smuggled vermouth and discussing the finer points of noir poetry and mildly illegal memoirs. She once wrote a sonnet cycle entirely in code, concealing messages for rum runners inside passages about long-lost lovers and boot polish. History calls her a criminal mastermind. Secretly, she just liked rhymes. In these stolen slivers of time, between shipments and shakedowns, gangsters carved out a private world where thoughts could be organized, feelings disguised as metaphors, and a fantasy version of themselves could finally win that last shootout, or avoid it entirely and open a florist shop in the Catskills. Of course, most of these works never saw the light of print. Many were burned, buried, or eaten by panicked underlings when a raid seemed imminent. But here and there, scraps survived. Torn napkins scribbled with haikus about the back of a Model T Ford. Paper wrappers with monologues in perfect iambic pentameter about fencing whiskey in Detroit. Little moth-bitten treasures that remind us crime and culture are twin vines, curling around each other in the moonlight. You might ask, what does this say about gangsters? Perhaps only this, that behind every gangster's grimace, there is a human being, deep down, delightfully conflicted, capable of both unspeakable acts and terribly awkward romantic dialogue. Capable, yes, of violence, yet also of syntax. And so the night stretches on, our typewriter keys quiet now, collecting dust and stories alike. But the secret writers of the underworld are never truly gone. Next, softly and in a whisper, we drift to another pastime laced with unlikely tenderness. One involving fashion, feathers, and the surprising kink in the collars of well-dressed crime. Some people paint to relax. Others collect stamps, play chess, or knit things with alarming enthusiasm. And then there were the gangsters of the 1920s, who, when not orchestrating criminal empires or having spirited disagreements with rival mobs, were surprisingly fond of petunias, tomatoes, and the fine art of patio design. Yes, dear dreamer, there is nothing quite so serene as imagining a hardened bootlegger in pinstripe trousers gently coaxing heirloom beans from Midwestern soil. Gardening was, oddly enough, just the thing for many gangsters after a long day of dodging federal agents and smuggling Canadian whiskey. It wasn't just about the fresh produce, though who could say no to a snappy green onion straight from the backyard? It was about control, predictability, and the peculiar therapy that comes from pruning tomato vines instead of enemies. Take, for example, Dean O'Banion, a Chicago mobster with a horticultural habit so intense that he owned part of a floral shop. While he was one of the more volatile figures in mob history, his genuine love for dahlias and funeral arrangements kept him rooted in both the botanical and metaphysical sense. He arranged flowers like he arranged hits, carefully, dramatically, and with a suspicious surplus of lilies. O'Banion's shop, near Holy Name Cathedral, was called Schofield's. He bought in, quite literally, to cover his other dealings, but it became a curious passion. He woke early, clipped stems, and reportedly gave stern advice to hydrangeas. His regular customers included priests, socialites, and occasionally rival gangsters. Ordering arrangements for the funerals of people they had helped expire. But it wasn't just Dean with dirty hands. Many gangsters embraced greenery in surprising ways. There are reports, only slightly exaggerated, of Al Capone keeping a rooftop bee garden. Now, Capone was not exactly a lavender-scented man, but it's true he enjoyed the idea of self-sufficiency and natural remedies. At one of his summer houses in Wisconsin, gardens flourished under the suspiciously well-armed blossoms of local mussel. Capone's love of the outdoors reportedly extended to hunting and fishing, perhaps more for the solitude than the sport. And then we have the lesser-known gangsters, the sidekicks and silent types, who kept backyard gardens full of garlic, peppers, and sometimes even medicinal herbs, though not always the kind one writes home about. Gardens provided a space where they were not wanted men, but simple stewards of soil and tomato stakes. Think, for a moment, of Rocco Two Trowel Manelli, a fictional but spiritually accurate composite of real gangsters who loved digging more than dealing. Rocco was said to plant roses with military precision. A bullet was never as inspiring to him as the sight of morning dew on fresh basil. He told anyone who would listen that marigolds kept away pests, both insect and human. It may not be verifiable science, but no one dared test him on it. Of course, their gardens weren't purely practical. In an era of prohibition raids and ambushes hiding around alleyway corners, a tomato patch might also double as a trapdoor entrance to a speakeasy. Carrots at the top, gin cocktails underneath. The ideal farming metaphor for a double life. Even their garden parties were events of paradox. Imagine it. Under bunting made of black market silk, guests sipped bootlegged limoncello amongst rows of corn. They toasted to the silent Roman god of agriculture, Ceres, while someone in the shed quietly counted cash from the poker room out back. What they could not grow in their gardens, they bartered for with neighbouring bootleggers. And in the off-seasons, many took to sketching plans, greenhouses with hulking safe rooms, lemon trees in climate-controlled conservatories that also concealed escape tunnels. Every geranium-filled pot, a statement of beauty, with just a dash of pragmatism and paranoia. Gardening seemed to offer a peculiar sort of moral composting, a way for these men to reclaim a scrap of domesticity in lives otherwise planted in criminal soil. Whatever other odd clippings they made in the dead of night, these sunlit seedlings formed their own neat rows of redemption. And while the Chicago outfit may not have published a gardening almanac, they left behind enough stories to convince us that even the most feared men of the era could wax poetic over worm castings and ask whether perennials should really be that droopy in June. Now, as the moonlight filters like silver through the leaves of forgotten gangster grapevines, let's wander a little deeper into a final chapter where the hum of jazz fades and the whispers of time come to rest. As the last traces of jazz filtered out over the moonlit rooftops of 1920s Chicago and the clinks of speakeasy glasses gave way to the hush of early morning, a curious thing happened. Gangsters went home to relax. Yes, relax. Not all of them were plotting bank heists beneath dangling bare bulbs or whispering threats over cannoli. No, dear dreamer. Many revelled in that most elusive art form of all, leisure. Picture it. A bootlegger, pockets stuffed with tonight's gin money, slips out of the smoky back room not to escape the law, but to make it home in time for his 2 a.m. bubble bath. He adds eucalyptus salts and hums a little Cole Porter tune. Meanwhile, his loyal accountant, yes, even gangsters had accountants, is already asleep upstairs with a mystery novel on his chest. Something cozy, probably Agatha Christie. Even outlaws needed closure. You see, the great myth of the 1920s gangster is that he never rested, but truly, He did. Beneath silk sheets, in velvet robes, often with a parrot named Tony, somewhere in the corner muttering obscenities learned at poker night. Alphonse Capone, known lovingly to the IRS as public enemy number one, had a fondness for hot milk before bed. Not a bad guy to share a midnight cup with, provided you didn't ask too many questions about his income statements. Capone also played banjo in a prison band later on, because even the most ferocious former racketeers need a little bluegrass before lights out. Bugsy Siegel had a thing for manicures. Real gangsters, after all, had reputations to maintain. You can't run Las Vegas with ragged cuticles and calloused hands, my friend. Most charming of all, Bugsy adored high-end hotel robes. Yes, the plush ones, and regularly stole them. A soft crime for a hard man. And Lucky Luciano, whose name sounds like a cocktail, but whose life was very much less delicious. Well, Lucky liked opera. He could recite entire arias, especially after a few too many cellar-age grappas. Imagine a mob boss belting Puccini while his bodyguards tried desperately to harmonize. There are fewer, sweeter sounds in recorded history, but for many less celebrated gangsters, the henchmen, the drivers, the underpaid bootleg bottlers, downtime was even simpler. They played cards, they smoked pipes, they took long walks along the Chicago River, talking softly about baseball and brunch. Yes, brunch. It wasn't called that back then, of course. But coal-fried chicken and flapjacks at 10:30 in the morning. That's brunch in any language. The illegal kind, shared beneath a tree in Lincoln Park, far from the roaring engine of vice. And then, perhaps the most tender pastime of all, gentlemen crooks tucked in their children. A few gangland dads told fables made up on the spot. Stories of donut-loving dragons and jazz-listening giraffes. Sweet dreams whispered through cigarette-tinged lips, beside nightstands stacked with newspaper clippings and half-written letters to mothers who always wondered what import-export really meant. Just before drifting off, many gangsters counted their blessings, not dollars, but real ones. Warm shoes, full bellies, the laughter of rum runners echoing down a hallway. Gratitude, it seems, didn't discriminate between saints and sinners. And so, as the moon swept across the sleeping cities, New York to Kansas City to St. Paul, all the noise of schemes and swagger gently dissolved into softer things. The clink of a ring on porcelain teacups, the crackle of a radio playing lullabies in between weather reports, and the faintest sound of a loyal cat curling up atop a nightstand covered in receipts and secrets. It's a strange thought, perhaps, that the powerful and the feared could be rocked to sleep by the same gentle quiet that soothes you now. But history is funny like that, less violent than it appears if you know when to lower the volume and listen for the quiet tending of daily lives. And so, suggestible listener of yesteryear's tales, may your dreams tonight be filled not with shootouts and sirens, but velvet chaise lounges, improvised lullabies, and steaming tea on a rainy bootlegging morning. The past is a soft place, seen from the distance of slumber. Good night.